The sky is still dark as Aisha's alarm pierces the silence of her small, modest house. She blinks sleep from her eyes, forcing herself up. The quiet of early morning wraps around her like a blanket, but it offers no comfort. She rises, moving with purpose and familiarity. There is no time to linger. In the tiny kitchen, she prepares breakfast for her 2 children, Maya and Jaden, who are still fast asleep. The counters are worn, the fridge hums weakly, but everything is in its place, well kept despite its age. Aisha glances at the clock and sighs softly. She needs to leave soon. The walk is long, 20 miles to be exact. She tries not to think about it. Instead, her focus shifts to her children. She makes sure their lunches are packed, their clothes are laid out neatly for school. Maya, her eldest, is 11, bright and sharp, always watching. Jaden, only 8, is still carefree, though Aisha worries. He's starting to pick up on the strain she works so hard to hide. She can't afford to let her children know how hard things have become. It's important that they feel safe, that they know she's got everything under control, even when she doesn't. Before leaving, Aisha quietly checks on them, pressing a light kiss to each forehead. The weight of her love for them anchors her, pushing her forward every single day. She straightens, takes a deep breath, and steps out into the pre-dawn chill. The day begins. The streets are empty as Aisha starts her walk. Her shoes are worn but still holding up for now. The familiar stretch of sidewalk in front of her seems endless. She moves quickly, efficiently, a pace she's perfected over months. Each step is measured, every breath controlled. The early morning air is crisp, biting at her skin, but she welcomes it. It's quiet. Peaceful. For a while, she can almost convince herself that this is normal, that this walk is just part of life and not a burden. As she passes the houses, the neighborhood shifts. The trees become sparse, the homes smaller and more spaced out. She turns down a long stretch of road where the street lights flicker unreliably. There's little to see now, just the industrial edge of town, with its chain-link fences and abandoned lots. The danger here is real, but Aisha has learned how to move through it. Head down, eyes forward, no unnecessary stops. The city feels like a different world in these early hours, hostile, cold, indifferent. The road is rough, cracked in places, forcing her to dodge potholes and uneven ground. She's tired, already feeling the ache in her legs, but stopping isn't an option. She presses on, mentally ticking off landmarks she passes. The small bridge, the corner store that's still shuttered. It's a rhythm now, something she's learned to live with. Each day, it takes a little more from her, but she pushes the exhaustion down. There's no room for weakness. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, she reaches the nursing home. The building is unremarkable, a squat structure that seems to sag with age. Inside, the halls are quiet, just the soft hum of machines and the murmur of nurses starting their shifts. Aisha exchanges brief greetings with her coworkers, hiding the weariness in her smile. She doesn't talk much about her walk, and they don't ask. Her patients are elderly, fragile. Aisha moves between them with care, adjusting pillows, offering gentle words, holding hands when needed. She's good at this, and she knows it. Her patience and kindness are her greatest assets here. The elderly residents, many of whom don't have families that visit, brighten when they see her. They trust her, rely on her presence to make their days a little less lonely. But there are moments, fleeting as they are, where the weight of her reality presses down. When her knees feel like they might give out as she bends to help a patient, or when her head throbs from too little sleep. In these moments, she catches herself, straightens, and reminds herself why she's doing this. Her kids. Her home. The life she's trying to hold together. By the time her shift ends, the day is fading. The sky outside is painted in soft oranges and pinks, but to Aisha, it signals the start of another long walk. She steps out, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud. Her body is sore, her feet aching from hours on them, but she doesn't linger. The walk home feels heavier. The day's events run through her mind, but more pressing are the thoughts of her children waiting for her. Maya will have done her homework. Jaden will likely be playing with his toys, unaware of the fatigue that hangs over his mother like a shadow. They depend on her for everything, and Aisha refuses to let them down. She walks in silence, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Her thoughts swirl, darting between practical worries and deeper, heavier ones. What if her shoes don't last much longer? What if she can't keep doing this? The doubts creep in, uninvited, but she shakes them off. She can't afford to think that way. Not now. The final stretch of her walk takes her through the quieter, more familiar streets of her neighborhood. The houses here are smaller, closer together. A few lights flicker in windows, but most are dark, the residents already settling in for the night. Aisha feels the pull of home, her tired legs pushing her forward with renewed urgency. She imagines the warmth inside, the sound of her children's voices, and it drives her onward. When she finally reaches her front door, it's well past dark. She stands there for a moment, hand on the knob, gathering herself. Inside, she knows she'll need to put on a brave face. She'll smile, ask her kids about their day, help them with anything they need, and never let them see how close she sometimes feels to breaking. It's a burden she carries alone, but she carries it willingly for them. With a deep breath, Aisha opens the door. She's home. Officer Daniel Wright was just getting the hang of things in this town. He was young, idealistic, and full of the hope that he could make a real difference. After growing up in a bustling city, this small town seemed quiet, almost too quiet. But it had its own rhythm, one that Daniel was still learning to follow. He and his wife Sarah had moved here a year ago, eager to settle down somewhere slower, somewhere they could build a life that felt manageable. Sarah loved it, the quiet streets, the friendly neighbors. Daniel was getting there. Every day, his patrol took him through the same routes. Small town, small problems, but he didn't mind that. If anything, it gave him a chance to really get to know the people, the streets, the places where trouble sometimes brewed. But this morning, something different caught his attention. It was just after dawn, the sky a soft gray, when he noticed her, a woman walking down one of the more isolated roads, her figure barely visible in the early light. He slowed his cruiser as he passed, giving her a brief glance. She wasn't in any distress, just walking. But something about it struck him as odd. Why would anyone be walking out here, at this hour, with no obvious destination nearby? Daniel didn't stop. He kept driving, but the image of her lingered. There was something in the way she walked, purposeful, determined, but tired. He made a mental note of the time, the place, and continued on his way. Over the next few hours, the town began to wake up. The morning routine of traffic and school buses took over, and Daniel focused on his job, but that woman stayed on his mind. He mentioned her to no one. It was just an observation, after all. Days passed, and each morning he saw her again. Always walking. Always the same road. Daniel started to adjust his patrol route slightly, just to catch a glimpse of her. She wasn't doing anything illegal or wrong, but his curiosity grew. Why was she walking? Where was she going? And why did she always seem so distant, so alone? His job had taught him to notice patterns, and her daily walks were becoming one he couldn't ignore. There was something else that bothered him, the road she walked. It wasn't a safe one. Isolated, with stretches that were barely lit at night and crossed into rougher parts of town, it wasn't the kind of place anyone should be on foot for that long. Daniel would drive by, watching her from a distance, wondering what her story was. Was she just someone who preferred walking, or was there more to it? A part of him itched to pull over and ask, but something held him back. He didn't want to scare her off or make her feel like she was doing something wrong. After several mornings of this silent observation, Daniel began to piece together what he could. She always walked at the same time, roughly around dawn, always heading in the same direction. By the time he finished his shift in the late afternoon, she was nowhere to be found on her way back, which made him wonder about her day. Did she work nearby? Was she traveling to some job far away? Every detail he could gather only raised more questions. He noticed she carried a small, worn bag and dressed simply, but appropriately for the weather, though her shoes looked like they'd seen better days. The more Daniel saw her, the more his curiosity turned into concern. He began to look forward to seeing her on his route, watching her movements more closely. But it wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. There was a knot in his stomach that told him something wasn't right. He had seen people in trouble before, people who didn't ask for help but needed it. What if she was one of them? But every time he thought about stopping, something held him back. What would he even say? "I've seen you walking every morning. Do you need help?" It felt intrusive. Maybe she would brush him off, or worse, think he was overstepping his boundaries. His job was to protect and serve, but there was a fine line between offering help and prying into someone's life. She didn't look like she needed rescuing. She was just walking. Still, the questions nagged at him. Daniel's wife, Sarah, noticed his unease. One evening as they sat together at home, she asked, "What's on your mind?" He hesitated before mentioning the woman, the way he'd seen her every morning, always on foot, always alone. Sarah listened carefully, her face soft with concern. "Maybe she's just someone who likes walking," she suggested gently. "But if it's bothering you, maybe you should talk to her. You don't have to make it a big deal, just see if she's okay." Daniel nodded, considering her advice. But something inside him was still hesitant. What if it was nothing? What if she was perfectly fine and didn't want anyone sticking their nose in her business? He had seen people struggle in silence before, proud and determined not to show their hardships. Maybe she was one of those people. Or maybe she was in a situation she couldn't talk about. Over the next few mornings, Daniel's suspicions deepened. He saw her again and again, each time feeling that pull to do something but still unsure. What was stopping him? It wasn't like he was accusing her of anything. But he knew from experience that some people don't want help, even when they need it. And then there were the other thoughts, the ones he tried to push away. What if she was in some kind of trouble? What if this walk was a sign of something more serious? Daniel began to make up stories in his head. Maybe she had no other choice. Maybe she couldn't afford a car or bus fare. Maybe she had no one else. Or maybe it was something more personal, something she didn't want anyone to know. He'd seen enough in his short time as an officer to know that everyone had their own struggles, and not all of them were visible from the outside. But the walk, 20 miles? That was a lot, even for someone who preferred walking. Each time he saw her, he debated with himself. He would slow his cruiser, watch her for a moment, and then drive on, promising himself that tomorrow he would stop, tomorrow he would ask. But tomorrow kept coming, and each time, he found himself hesitating. It wasn't just about his curiosity anymore. It was about what it meant if she really was struggling. Daniel wasn't sure he was ready for that conversation, the one where someone admits that they're in over their head but don't know how to ask for help. He had seen enough pride in people to know it was a hard thing to let go of. Daniel sat in his patrol car, hands resting on the steering wheel, mind racing. He had seen her every morning for the past few weeks, Aisha, the woman walking that long stretch of road at dawn. Today felt different. He could feel it in his gut. It was time to stop wondering and start finding answers. What was her story? Why was she walking so far every day, seemingly with no end in sight? His curiosity had grown into concern, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed help, whether she asked for it or not. This time, he didn't just drive past her. He made the decision, almost impulsively, to follow her, though at a distance. He kept his cruiser far enough back that she wouldn't notice him right away, but close enough to observe her every move. His eyes stayed fixed on her small figure as she walked, head down, arms swinging in a steady rhythm, like someone on a mission. Her stride was purposeful, yet there was a heaviness in it, the kind that comes from days, maybe months, of wear and tear. As the minutes passed, Daniel's heart raced slightly. He watched as Aisha crossed an intersection without slowing down, the light barely yellow when she stepped off the curb. Cars sped past her, but she didn't flinch. She had done this before, probably many times. There was a familiarity to her steps, the way she navigated the potholes, uneven sidewalks, and broken glass littering the ground. It was clear this path wasn't new to her. It was part of her routine, her life. But Daniel noticed more than just the streets she walked. He saw the fatigue weighing on her. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, her pace, though determined, wasn't quick. She was moving out of necessity, not choice. The sun began to rise higher, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the temperature climbed steadily. Daniel's car was cool with air conditioning, but he could see the sweat starting to bead on Aisha's forehead. She wiped it away absent-mindedly and kept moving, never stopping for a break. The more he watched, the more Daniel felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just someone who liked walking. This was someone who had no other choice. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he followed her through another stretch of town, the surroundings becoming more industrial, less welcoming. The area grew rougher, littered with graffiti-covered walls and closed-down businesses. This wasn't a place to be walking alone, especially not early in the morning. Then, something shifted in Daniel. Watching her, seeing her push through exhaustion, through the dangers of the road, stirred something deep inside him. A protective instinct he couldn't ignore. He saw her stumble slightly on a crack in the sidewalk but catch herself just in time, barely slowing her pace. Her shoes were worn, almost threadbare, and he could tell that every step must have hurt. Still, she pushed on. By now, Daniel wasn't just curious. He was worried. This wasn't sustainable. How long had she been doing this? How much longer could she go before something gave out? Her shoes, her body, or worse, her spirit. He realized he had to do more than just follow. He needed to talk to her, to understand what was driving her to endure this daily grind. He sped up slightly, pulling alongside her. For a moment, he just watched as she walked, unaware of his presence. Then, he rolled down his window. "Hey!" he called gently, trying not to startle her. Aisha turned her head sharply, surprise flashing across her face, but her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You all right?" he asked, keeping his voice casual, though inside, his heart was pounding. Aisha straightened her back, clearly putting on a brave front. "I'm fine," she replied, a little too quickly. Her tone was polite but guarded, her eyes flicking to the police car and then back to the road in front of her. She picked up her pace slightly, as if that would end the conversation. Daniel stayed with her, driving slowly to keep up. "I've noticed you walking this road a lot lately," he said. "It's a long way. Do you need a ride?" Aisha's jaw tightened. "I'm fine," she repeated, her voice firm now. She didn't stop walking, didn't even glance at him again. "Thank you, though." Daniel could hear the edge in her voice, the mix of pride and irritation. He didn't want to push her, but he couldn't let it go. "I'm not trying to bother you," he said, keeping his tone even. "I just want to make sure you're okay. That's a long walk to take every day." Aisha finally stopped, turning fully to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of exhaustion, maybe frustration. "Look," she began, her voice quieter now but still strong. "I walk because I have to. My car broke down months ago, and I can't afford to fix it. There's no bus that runs out here, and I've got 2 kids at home depending on me. So I walk. That's it. I don't need a ride, I don't need help. I'm just doing what I have to do." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Daniel had expected. She wasn't asking for pity or charity. She wasn't even complaining. She was simply explaining her reality. And it hit him hard. This woman, who walked miles every day through dangerous, exhausting conditions, was doing it all for her family, not asking anyone for anything. Her pride, her resilience, it was palpable. Daniel didn't know what to say at first. He felt a deep respect for her, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. How could he just drive away, knowing what he knew now? "I get it," he said finally, his voice softer. "I really do. But you shouldn't have to do this every day. It's not safe." Aisha's face softened just a little, but her defenses were still up. "I've been doing it for months," she said, "and I'll keep doing it if I have to. I don't want charity, officer." He nodded, understanding her need to maintain her dignity. It's not about charity, he said, carefully choosing his words. It's about making sure you're okay. I've seen enough to know this can't be easy. Aisha crossed her arms, her stance still firm. Nothing about life is easy, she said, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. But I'm managing. Daniel could see it in her eyes, the weight she carried, the determination that kept her moving forward. He realized there was no simple solution to this. He couldn't just offer her a ride and call it a day. She wasn't someone who would accept help easily, and she didn't want to be seen as weak. But he also knew that walking 20 miles every day, in all kinds of weather, was slowly wearing her down. I respect that, Daniel said finally. But if you ever need anything at all, you can call me. Or just wave me down if you see me. I'm out here every day. Aisha looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him. Thanks, she said, her tone still cautious but less defensive. But like I said, I'm okay. With that, she turned and resumed her walk. Daniel watched her for a few moments before slowly pulling away. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more, but he also knew he had to respect her boundaries. She was proud, and rightfully so. Daniel had debated offering Aisha a ride again, but after that initial conversation, he hesitated. He knew she was fiercely independent, and the last thing he wanted was to make her feel pitted. But after seeing her trudging through another grueling day, her feet dragging slightly more than before, he couldn't stand by any longer. He pulled up beside her again, and this time, when he asked, she didn't immediately refuse. I can take you a little closer, he said, keeping his voice casual. Just to the next block or so. No strings. Aisha paused, looking down the road ahead of her. The sun was beating down hard that afternoon, and her feet ached. She glanced at Daniel, the look in her eyes still hesitant, but something softened. Just to the next block, she repeated, making it clear this was temporary. She didn't need a ride, she was accepting it. There was a difference. She climbed in, and for a few moments they sat in silence. The air in the car was cooler, and Aisha let out a soft sigh, more from the relief than anything else. Daniel didn't push the conversation, just drove slowly, keeping his eyes on the road. Eventually, she broke the silence. Thanks, she muttered, not looking at him. Of course, he said. It's no trouble at all. The conversation remained stilted, polite but stiff. Daniel asked a few questions about her day, and Aisha responded briefly, always polite but not quite open. When they reached the block she had agreed to, she glanced over and gave a small nod. I'll walk from here, she said, starting to reach for the door handle. Daniel nodded. Anytime you want, I'm around, he said as she stepped out. Aisha didn't say much in response, just a quiet, thank you, before she continued on foot. It became a bit of a pattern. Over the next few days, Daniel would cross paths with Aisha at different points along her walk. She began accepting his offers for a ride, though always on her terms. He would drive her for a mile or two, then let her finish the rest on her own. She never allowed him to take her the full way to work, but little by little, the distance shortened. As they shared more rides, the awkwardness began to fade. They started talking, small things at first, about the weather, their routines. Aisha was still reserved, but the stiffness was easing. One afternoon, Daniel picked her up as usual, and they drove in comfortable silence for a while before Aisha finally spoke up about her kids. Maya's 10, and Jaden's 7, she said, almost as if she had decided to let her guard down just a little. They keep me going. Sometimes, when I feel like I can't take another step, I just think about them and push through. Daniel glanced at her. They sound like great kids. They are, Aisha said, her voice softening, the pride evident. They don't know how much I walk. I don't want them to. They deserve to feel safe, you know? Like they don't have to worry about grown-up stuff. Daniel nodded. I get that. I try to keep work separate from home, too. I don't bring the tough days home to Sarah. Aisha turned to him with a curious look. Sarah's your wife? Yeah, we've been married about 4 years now. She works at the school, does counseling. Helps kids going through tough stuff. Aisha seemed to consider that for a moment. That's good. Kids need someone who listens. They do, Daniel agreed. She's great at it. Their conversations grew a little longer each day, and with each ride, Aisha seemed more willing to share pieces of her life. She told Daniel about how Maya was starting to outgrow her shoes, how Jaden loved building with Legos but they couldn't afford the new sets he wanted. Daniel listened carefully, nodding, but never offering suggestions or solutions. He knew better than to do that. For his part, Daniel talked about how he was still adjusting to the town, how it was different from where he'd grown up, a little quieter, a little closer-knit. Aisha listened but rarely offered advice, just a nod here or there, understanding the feeling of needing to adapt without making a fuss. But as the days passed, Daniel found himself thinking more and more about Aisha's situation, especially when he was back home with Sarah. One night, over dinner, he brought it up, unable to hold it in any longer. "There's this woman I've been giving rides to," he said, picking at his food. "She walks miles every day to get to work. She's got 2 kids, and she's doing it all on her own. Her car broke down months ago, and she can't afford to fix it." Sarah raised her eyebrows. "That's rough. How's she managing?" "She's not asking for help," Daniel said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I mean, she's letting me give her rides now, but just a little. She's proud. She doesn't want charity." Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking. That's a tough spot. People like that, they've been through a lot. It's hard for them to accept help because they've had to rely on themselves for so long. "I know," Daniel sighed. "I just don't know what to do. I want to help her more, but I don't want to undermine her. If I just fix her car or give her money, she'll probably feel insulted." Sarah nodded slowly. "You can't force it. But maybe there's another way. Sometimes people are more open to help when it's not so direct. Like maybe you don't give her money, but you find a way to help without her feeling like it's a handout." Daniel frowned, considering her words. "But how?" Sarah smiled gently. "You've already started. By giving her rides, you're building trust. That's the first step. The rest? You'll figure it out." He sat back, still torn. Aisha wasn't someone who needed saving. She was strong, capable, and resilient. But that didn't mean she couldn't use a break, something to lighten the load. Yet Sarah was right. It had to be on Aisha's terms, or not at all. The next day, when Daniel saw Aisha walking again, he pulled up beside her, and this time, she got in without hesitation. As they drove, the conversation flowed more naturally, touching on their shared struggles, their dreams for the future. There was a growing understanding between them, an unspoken bond. But beneath the surface, Daniel was still wrestling with how to help her in a way that respected her strength and dignity. He knew he couldn't sit back forever. But for now, the rides were enough. He'd let her set the pace. Sarah sat across from Daniel one evening, her face lit with the glow of an idea. "What if we got her car fixed, but without her knowing it was us? Like a community thing?" she suggested, her eyes bright with excitement. "That way, it's not charity from one person, it's just the town showing support for someone who deserves it." Daniel leaned back, considering her words. "A fundraiser?" he asked, unsure. She'd never accept it if she knew it was for her. "Exactly," Sarah said, leaning forward. "We don't tell her. We just make it happen. Quietly. We can get her car fixed, maybe even get some groceries or help with the kids' school supplies. She wouldn't have to know who all pitched in." Daniel felt a flicker of hope. This was exactly what he'd been wrestling with, how to help without hurting her pride. He nodded slowly. "You think people would go for it?" Sarah smiled. "Trust me. If we explain why, they'll be lining up to help." They agreed to start small. The plan had to stay under the radar, and Aisha couldn't catch wind of it. Sarah reached out to her network, fellow teachers, parents, and friends, telling them about Aisha's long walks, her dedication to her kids, and her refusal to ask for help. Meanwhile, Daniel began talking to his coworkers at the station, explaining the same. People were eager to help almost immediately. "She's been walking 20 miles a day, and she never asked for anything?" one neighbor asked, shaking her head. "Of course we'll pitch in." Sarah created a private group on social media to spread the word even further, explaining that the goal was to raise enough to get Aisha's car fixed without her ever knowing who contributed. The responses poured in. Donations started small. $20 here, $10 there. But as word spread, the contributions grew. The local mechanic, upon hearing the story, offered to fix the car for free if they could cover the cost of parts. One woman who worked at a grocery store volunteered to donate food for Aisha's family, and another parent from Maya's school quietly sent over a gift card for new shoes for the kids. Daniel and Sarah were amazed at how quickly things were coming together. They hadn't expected the town to rally this much. People who barely knew Aisha were eager to help. "She's done so much for her family," one of Aisha's coworkers at the nursing home said when she handed Sarah an envelope of cash. "She's one of the hardest workers I've ever seen. Always smiling, even when I know she's tired. It's time someone did something for her." As the donations grew, so did the complexity of keeping the plan secret. Daniel found himself coordinating with a mechanic, arranging for a time when Aisha wouldn't be home so they could take the car without her noticing. Sarah managed the influx of donations and tried to juggle the logistics without Aisha's coworkers or neighbors accidentally letting the secret slip. One morning, Daniel and Sarah met in their kitchen to tally up the donations. They'd raised more than enough to cover the repairs, plus extra for things Aisha and her kids needed. "We've got enough to get her back on her feet," Sarah said, beaming. "And then some." But as the fundraiser grew, so did the tension. Keeping everything under wraps was harder than they thought. Daniel found himself feeling anxious whenever he saw Aisha during their rides. He worried that she might sense something was going on. He had to remind himself not to let anything slip in conversation, keeping his usual demeanor when he picked her up. "Everything okay?" Aisha asked one afternoon when she noticed Daniel seemed distracted. "Yeah, all good," Daniel said quickly, smiling. "Just thinking about work." But as the days passed, it became harder for both Daniel and Sarah to keep their excitement in check. The fundraiser had turned into something much larger than they'd anticipated. It wasn't just about fixing Aisha's car anymore. It was about showing her that the community cared, that she wasn't alone in her struggle. But they had to make sure she didn't feel like it was charity. It was a delicate balance. Meanwhile, the mechanic had finished the repairs on Aisha's car. He'd replaced the tires, fixed the engine, and even cleaned it up inside and out. "She's going to think it's brand new," he told Daniel when he handed over the keys. Now came the most challenging part, getting the car back to Aisha without her realizing what had happened until the last minute. They planned to have it parked outside her house one morning, fully restored, with a note that simply read, "From your community, with love." Daniel and Sarah worked with Aisha's neighbors to organize the drop-off. On the designated day, early before Aisha woke up for her shift, a small group gathered quietly outside her house. Some of the people who had contributed stood by, eager to see the moment unfold but mindful of keeping things discreet. They parked the newly repaired car in front of her house, placing a few extra gifts, groceries, school supplies, and the note, inside the car. As they stepped back, ready to leave before Aisha came outside, Daniel couldn't help but feel nervous. They'd managed to rally the whole community behind the scenes, but now it was time to see if their plan would work without overwhelming Aisha. Sarah squeezed his hand. "She's going to be okay," she whispered. "She'll see that it's not about pity. It's about community." Daniel nodded, watching as the group slowly dispersed, leaving behind the restored car and the note. Now, all they had to do was wait for Aisha to come outside and discover the quiet outpouring of love from the people around her. Aisha woke up to the sound of birds chirping, a warm morning sun filtering through her curtains. She stretched, feeling the familiar weight of her day ahead. As she walked towards the window, something caught her eye. Her car. The same car that had been sitting in the driveway, broken and untouched for weeks, was now gleaming under the sunlight. It looked new, as if nothing had ever happened to it. For a moment, Aisha stood there, unable to move. Her mind raced. Could this be real? She hurried outside, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. As she stepped out of her front door, she saw them. The whole community. They stood in her yard, smiling and waiting. Some held balloons, others small wrapped packages. Aisha blinked. This couldn't be real. She had been so used to handling everything alone, so accustomed to keeping her struggles to herself, that this moment felt like a dream. Surprise! They all shouted in unison. Her heart skipped a beat. She was frozen in place, unsure of how to react. Her gaze shifted from one familiar face to another. There was Mr. Patel from down the street, the elderly woman who always waved to her on her morning walks, even the kids from the local school. People she saw every day, yet hardly knew, were all gathered for her. "We fixed your car," someone said, stepping forward with a wide smile. It was John, the mechanic she had visited once when her tires needed replacing. "A little bit of elbow grease from everyone, and it's as good as new." The words washed over her, but it was hard to process. How had this happened? Why? Before she could ask, a young girl handed her a small bouquet of flowers, wrapped clumsily but with care. "For you," she said, her face beaming with pride. Aisha took the flowers, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the crowd gathered closer, someone handed her a box of homemade cookies. Another gave her a small card with a handwritten note. There were so many gifts, all small tokens of appreciation, yet each one carrying so much weight. Aisha's chest tightened, her emotions a whirlwind. She had spent so long trying to keep everything together, working extra shifts, saving every penny to get her car fixed. Now here they were, the very people she had thought wouldn't notice, coming together for her. Her lips parted, but no words came. She felt a lump in her throat. Gratitude, disbelief, and something else, a deep, profound sense of community, washed over her. John's voice broke through her thoughts. "We know you've been going through a tough time, Aisha. We just wanted to show you that you're not alone." Those words. "You're not alone," they echoed in her mind, hitting her harder than anything else. For so long, she had carried everything herself. Now, here was a reminder, a glaring one, that she didn't have to. But her pride, always lurking, whispered in her ear. She didn't ask for this. She didn't want to be a charity case. She wasn't weak, she didn't need help. Did she? Her hands clutched the bouquet tighter as a battle raged within her. The weight of their kindness pressed against the walls she had built around herself. She tried to smile, to appear gracious, but the emotion was too much. Her lips quivered, her vision blurred. The first tear fell before she could stop it. And once it started, it didn't stop. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. But it was too late. She was crying now, openly, the tears spilling down her cheeks. The community didn't judge her for it. No one looked away awkwardly or pretended not to notice. Instead, a few stepped closer, offering silent support. Aisha wiped at her face, her fingers shaking. I don't know what to say," she stammered, trying to regain control of her emotions. I never expected this." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. They had done something incredible, something she never imagined. And they deserved to know how much it meant to her, even if she couldn't find the right words. I've always tried to handle things on my own," she began, her voice wavering but growing stronger with each word. "And sometimes I forget that it's okay to accept help. I didn't think anyone saw how much I was struggling, but you all did. And you did this amazing thing for me." The crowd listened quietly, some nodding in understanding, others just watching her with kind eyes. "I don't even know how to thank you properly," she continued, her words coming faster now. "This is more than just fixing a car. This is reminding me that I'm not alone, that I have people around me who care." She paused, looking down at the gifts in her hands. "I've been so focused on trying to do everything by myself that I forgot what it means to be part of a community. And today, you've reminded me of that. You've shown me more kindness than I could have ever asked for." Aisha looked up, meeting their gazes. She could feel the warmth radiating from them, the genuine care in their eyes. It wasn't just about the car. It was about something bigger. "I promise you," she said, her voice steady now, "I will pay this forward. I will make sure that I help others the way you've helped me. I will never forget this." The crowd smiled, some clapping softly. Aisha took another deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in months. The burden she had carried alone for so long didn't feel as heavy anymore. She had people around her, people who cared, and that was something she would never take for granted again. In that moment, surrounded by her community, Aisha knew that things would be different. She didn't have to do everything alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't scare her. It filled her with hope. Aisha sat behind the wheel of her car, her hands lightly gripping the steering wheel as the engine hummed quietly. It felt different now driving. Each mile was no longer a reminder of her struggles but a marker of her newfound ease. The days of walking miles to work, rain or shine, were finally behind her. She had her mornings back. She could now wake up with enough time to have breakfast with her kids instead of rushing out the door, already bracing herself for the long trek ahead. The drive to work, which once seemed like an unattainable luxury, had become part of her daily routine. Aisha found herself smiling more often, arriving at work less drained, less weary. She had energy left for the things that truly mattered: her children, her life outside of the endless cycle of exhaustion. In the evenings, she returned home without the weight of exhaustion pulling her down. Dinner was no longer a hurried affair, and there was time for laughter, time for stories, time to simply be present. Her coworkers noticed the change too. She was sharper, more focused. Even her boss commented on the shift. Aisha hadn't realized just how much the endless walking had taken from her until it was no longer a necessity. Now, her days had a rhythm that didn't leave her constantly catching up. She began to thrive in a way she hadn't thought possible just months before. But as her life became smoother, Aisha couldn't shake the memory of how everything had changed. It wasn't just the car. It was the community. Their unexpected generosity had lifted her in a way she hadn't known she needed. And now, with the clarity that only comes from being given a second chance, Aisha felt an urge deep inside. She had to give back. One evening, as the kids were in bed, Aisha sat at her kitchen table, a notepad in front of her. The idea had been swirling in her mind for weeks, and now it was beginning to take shape. She wanted to do something meaningful, something that would help others the way she had been helped. She thought back to all the moments she had felt alone, every time she had wished for just a little bit of support, a little bit of understanding. A charity. It was ambitious, but why not? She didn't want anyone else to feel the way she had, like they had to do it all alone. The next day, Aisha called Daniel and Sarah. They were the two people in the community who had been instrumental in organizing the surprise for her. If anyone could help her make this happen, it was them. She wasn't sure how to start, but Daniel had always been resourceful, and Sarah knew everyone in town. They met over coffee, and Aisha laid out her idea. A charity aimed at helping people who were in the same situation she had been, struggling with transportation, needing just a little help to get back on their feet. "I want to help people get cars, or at least help with transportation costs," Aisha explained. "Maybe we can start small. Fundraise for repairs, bus passes, anything that helps people move forward." Daniel leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "It's a great idea. And I think we can do it." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "People will support it, Aisha. You know how much this community values coming together. If we can get the word out, people will want to contribute." They spent the next few hours brainstorming, laying out the first steps. Daniel knew a few local business owners who might be willing to sponsor them, and Sarah had experience organizing events. Aisha's excitement grew with each passing minute. This wasn't just a fleeting thought anymore. It was becoming real. By the end of their meeting, they had a rough plan in place for their first fundraising event. Weeks later, the day of the charity's first event arrived. It was a modest affair, held in the local community center, but the energy was electric. The event was aimed at raising funds to provide transportation assistance to families who needed it most. There were booths with local vendors who had donated their time and goods, and several local artists had come to showcase their work, agreeing to give a portion of their sales to the cause. Aisha stood at the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. She was nervous, but also excited. The turnout was better than she had expected. Families, friends, and even strangers had come to support the cause. The community had shown up in full force once again. There was a raffle, a silent auction, and a small speech from Aisha herself, where she explained the purpose of the charity. Her words were simple, but they came from the heart. She told the story of her own struggles and how the community's support had been a lifeline for her. "I know what it feels like to be stuck," Aisha said, her voice steady. "To feel like you're moving through life but not getting anywhere. And that's why I started this. To help people get unstuck. To give others the same support that was given to me." As she spoke, she saw nods of understanding from the crowd. These were people who knew what it meant to struggle, to fight every day just to stay afloat. And now they were here, ready to help others do the same. By the end of the night, the charity had raised more than Aisha had hoped. The funds would go towards helping families with car repairs, providing bus passes, and even setting up a small fund for down payments on vehicles. It was a small start, but it was a start nonetheless. As Aisha looked around the room, watching people laugh, talk, and celebrate the success of the event, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was her new beginning, but it was also a new beginning for so many others. The journey ahead was long, but Aisha knew she wasn't walking it alone anymore. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Aisha sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea as the early morning light filtered through the window. She couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in such a short time. Not long ago, she had been walking miles to work, her feet sore and her spirit heavy with the weight of everything she had to carry on her own. Now she had her car, her charity, and the unwavering support of the people around her. Life had shifted in ways she never could have imagined. The community's kindness had sparked something inside her, a strength she hadn't realized she had. She used to think resilience meant pushing through on her own, but now she understood that true strength came from accepting help when needed and offering it in return. It wasn't just her life that had changed, it was how she saw herself. She was no longer just a mother struggling to make ends meet. She was a leader, someone who could give back to those who had lifted her when she was down. Her charity was still in its early stages, but already, it had started making a difference. A single mother had been able to get her car repaired through one of their programs, allowing her to take a better job in the next town over. A family who had been relying on inconsistent public transportation now had bus passes that allowed their children to attend school regularly. Every story she heard reminded Aisha of her own journey, of the challenges she had faced, and the immense relief that came with even the smallest bit of help. Aisha looked at her kids playing in the living room, their laughter filling the space. She felt a deep sense of pride. The exhaustion she once carried, the constant feeling of just trying to survive, had lifted. She was present for them now in ways she hadn't been able to be before. She could sit with them in the evenings, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally too. She had the energy to be there, truly be there, and that was everything. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Daniel, asking if she had time for coffee. Smiling, she sent a quick reply. Daniel had been her rock during this whole process. Without his guidance and support, she wasn't sure the charity would have taken off as smoothly as it had. He always seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and how to make things happen. Later that afternoon, Aisha met Daniel at their usual spot, a small cafe nestled in the heart of the neighborhood. He was already seated when she arrived, 2 cups of coffee on the table. "You're always ahead of the game," Aisha joked, sitting down across from him. Daniel chuckled. Just trying to keep up with you. You've been doing some incredible things, Aisha. She blushed slightly, still not entirely used to the praise. I couldn't have done it without you. Honestly, I wouldn't have even known where to start. Daniel waved her off, but there was a warmth in his eyes. You would have figured it out. You've always had this drive, this spark. It just needed a little nudge. Aisha smiled, grateful for his words. It's funny. I used to think I had to do everything by myself. I thought that asking for help meant I was failing somehow. But now, looking back, I realize that everything I've been able to do, everything I've accomplished, it's all because of the people who stepped in when I needed them. That's the thing about community, Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. It's not about who can do the most on their own. It's about lifting each other up, giving what you can when you can, and accepting help when it's offered. It's a cycle, and you're a perfect example of that now. Aisha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. It wasn't about independence in the way she used to think. It was about connection, about building something together that no one could do alone. She had seen that firsthand, how her life had turned around when she let others in, and now, how she was able to do the same for others. Do you ever think about where we'd be if none of this had happened? Aisha asked, her voice soft. Daniel thought for a moment before responding. I think we'd be okay, but we wouldn't be where we are now. You've grown so much, and honestly, so have I. Helping you has reminded me why we need each other. Why communities matter. Aisha nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside her. She had been through so much, but she had come out the other side stronger, more compassionate, and more capable than she ever thought possible. And now, she had the chance to give that same strength to others. You're one of the strongest people I know, Aisha, Daniel said, his voice sincere. You didn't just take what was given to you, you turned it into something more. You're doing something real, something lasting. Thank you, Aisha said quietly. That means more than you know. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee. There wasn't much left to say. They both knew what they had built together, and the impact it was having. It was enough. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, Aisha knew it was time to head home. She had another charity event tomorrow, and there was still a lot to prepare. She and Daniel said their goodbyes, promising to meet again soon. The next morning, Aisha stood outside her home, watching her kids climb into the back seat of the car. The event was set to take place in the community park, and her kids were excited to help out. They had started to understand what their mother was doing, why she spent so much time working on the charity, and they were proud of her. Aisha got into the driver's seat and looked in the rearview mirror at her children's smiling faces. She started the engine, feeling the car come to life beneath her. This was more than just a vehicle to her, it was a symbol of how far she had come. The road ahead still held challenges, but she knew now that she wasn't walking it alone. As she pulled out of the driveway, she glanced at the houses around her, some of them already stirring with activity. The people who had once been strangers were now part of her story. They had helped her in ways she would never forget, and now, they were part of something bigger. Aisha's car moved down the familiar streets, past the places she had once walked, past the corners where she had felt so tired and alone. Now, she was driving with purpose, with hope, with a future that looked brighter than she had ever imagined. And with every mile, she carried with her the knowledge that, with the support of others, anything was possible.